Okay, hello everyone. My name is Nikita Shimchuk, and today I'm filming this interview, this conversation on the topic of religion, and specifically on the topic of Christianity with an extremely interesting person. He is an American scientist, historian, professor, doctor of philosophy, an individual who spent many years of his academic career in such places as Cambridge, Harvard, and Oxford. My guest is Professor Raymond Joseph Hoffmann. Okay, let's go. So, Professor Joseph, it is a real pleasure to see you here today. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you for accepting my kind invitation to this, well, not even interview, but I'd say conversation.
Sure.
So it is an honor, thank you very much. And to begin with, I know that you, Professor, are German, right, originally. You moved to the United States when you were a kid, and then when you grew up, you started your academic career in the field of history, religion, and even theology. So, if I'm not mistaken, you obtained your master's degree in theological studies in Harvard, and then you became PhD in Oxford.
Yeah.
So, my first question is, why history and why religion? So, how come you became so interested in these spheres?
I haven't thought about that question very often, and I think about it more now than I did when I was a student or a graduate student or even a young PhD. I guess this is what happens as you get older. You have time to think back of the decisions that you made and why you made them. Um, but it's interesting because I think now, I didn't think this always, but I think now that my own biography was part of that decision-making process. I wasn't really super interested in religion as a kid. I came from a sort of typical German family who left Germany. I had a Jewish grandmother. My mother converted to Christianity. I was not born yet, obviously. My mother came first, and the decisions about religion were all made before I was born. But after I was born, my sister, my father, mother, and I relocated, not because of religious persecution, because that was kind of over. The Jews had been killed, Auschwitz had happened, all of that was in the past. But it was part of the conversation. Even when I was a kid, it was part of the conversation, because we all had relatives who had been either forced to leave the country or who went to Auschwitz and places like that. So we went to Boston, which is much nicer than Auschwitz, and my father got a job. Something that people don't know, sort of outside Europe, and especially outside Germany and Eastern Europe, is that after the war, there was a huge surge in births. It was called the baby boom. I was part of that boom, but it hadn't happened when my father started his university teaching career. So there were no jobs because there were no men. There were no boys to teach, right? They'd all been drafted into the army. They died in the war. Germany was almost empty of people. And I think that all of these things for me became religious questions. I mean, at a certain point, I go to a new country, I sort of learn a foreign language, not too easily, not too well, not too happily, but I learn a foreign language. I was lucky because I was in Boston, which is not just any old American city. It has a lot of, educational opportunity. My father was teaching at Harvard, or I wouldn't have gotten in. But my father was teaching there. He was a mathematician. And there was a lot of interest in hiring mathematicians in those days because America had gone pro-science and pro, sort of technical subjects in those days. And I wasn't good at any of those things. So I decided that I would, after I got in, I wasn't quite sure what I would do. But I chose, originally I sort of studied literature, but the literature got me into the study of religion. And Harvard was very clear that the way you study religion there is the Germans had a word for it, but Americans don't. It's called Religionswissenschaft, the science of religion. You study it from the standpoint of a social science. You study it through anthropology, or you study it through archaeology, or you study it through
ancient texts, maybe also.
Yeah. I mean, it was very precise. you also studied some theology because you have to know what different people believe, different faiths hold in common and what they hold differently. So that was fascinating to me. I thought, this is great. You've got so many options here. Why don't people all just believe one thing? But I got beyond that. Then I got sort of interested when I went on to do my PhD. I got more interested in cultural history because religion is a part of culture. The context is as interesting as the subject. And so I got more interested. I had to get more interested in languages, and I had to get more interested in anthropology and fields like that, which were approaches to the understanding of religion. And that was it. That's the whole story. Sort of from kid to student to young PhD. That's the whole story.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So, in this case, what, in your opinion, is religion? So, how can you scientifically and also personally define religion?
Well,
yeah, it may sound simple question, but the answer.
Don't launch me into my lectures in Religion 101, the understanding of religion.
Yeah, so just in general.
It has to be very general. General is best. It's something that people do. It doesn't seem to most people who study it
As a social science, it doesn't seem optional because we don't know of any cultures that haven't developed it. So, in the early 2000s, about 2010, 2011, there were a number of scientists like Richard Dawkins and Lawrence Krauss at Arizona. Dawkins was from Oxford. I used to go hear him lecture, in fact, when I was a student. And they were very anti-religion. In fact, Dawkins thought that the study of religion should not be part of a university curriculum because it was superstition. You're just studying mythology. Call it mythology. Don't call it anything else. It's a cool idea, but it's a little oversimplified. And so religion is something that people do. It can be something that people believe, but it doesn't have to be. It sometimes has a concept of a god or gods. Sure. Or things that are like gods or fate or something like that. It has a number of common features, and you can sort of graph these or chart these and make different distinctions between the kinds of religions, between, say, a monotheistic religion like Islam or Christianity, theoretically, and a polytheistic religion such as Greek paganism, or although all my Hindu friends would hate me to describe them as polytheistic, but it does look polytheistic to most people. And the ancient Chinese religions, I mean, they come and go. It's a flow of belief, which has a global incidence, which means it happens everywhere. Right? We don't know any tribes in the Amazon or any people in what had been darkest Africa in the 19th century that existed without religion or without some kind of belief in some power, right? So that's what's interesting, the fact that it's a universal thing, but it comes in so many different flavors. It comes in so many different shapes and sizes. So it's an inexhaustible source of information and entertainment.
Yeah, and so considering what you have just said, a German philosopher and historian, Rudolf Otto, in one of his works, I think approximately 100 years ago, wrote that the presence of transcendence, or transcendental, was always a huge, substantial part of our human life. And well, in other words, based on his works, we as humans, we have always felt that somewhere there was something bigger than us, stronger than us, something ubiquitous, and maybe even that created us. And well, basically, according to Otto, this transcendence is the real source of religiosity and of any form of religion. And that's why my question is, what do you think about transcendence, about the phenomenon of transcendence, and about its impact on human history? So is it something that existed always during our history, or it just, occurred all of a sudden at some point?
He was one of my first heroes, Rudolf Otto.
Really?
But only at Harvard, he was sort of a hero all over the place there. And he was a great place to begin for people who weren't too religious. I mean, people who weren't really into a special kind of religion, like Catholic or Protestant or one of those things, Orthodox, whatever, because he was trying to describe it. The fashionable word was phenomenologically, right? A phenomenon is something that happens in every society, and he thought that one of the ways to describe this, it was as he uses the word fascinating, fascinans. He uses the word mystery, mysterium tremendum, right? But the key thing in his work is that God is mysterium tremendum, a tremendous mystery, right? And he thinks that this is something that's built into human nature, right? Not that we like to be tricked or fooled or lied to, but that's not what he's talking about. He's not talking about the church. He's not talking about the synagogue or the mosque.
No,
He's
it's not about the institution, right?
Yeah, he's talking about the phenomenon that is mainly felt. And it's that, when you systematize it, that becomes religion. And also that leaves it open for abuse. It leaves it open for defining it too narrowly, right? You believe this and nothing else because this is true and this isn't true. Otto doesn't deal with truth. He deals with the phenomenon. Very Kantian kind of guy he was. Yeah, he deals with the phenomenon of religion as something that affects you. And it affects you even if you don't think it affects you. He's got us going and coming, right? It affects you because it affects the people around you, so it affects your context. It affects. I believe that because I think that's part of the reason I got interested too. It wasn't anything specific, not because my parents were deeply religious, because they were deeply not religious, but the situation had everything to do with who you were religiously, or what most German people believed religiously at the time. So I think he was, I mean, I wouldn't call any scholar or any philosopher a prophet, but he was as close as it came to having somebody who could really describe the way religion worked, as a social thing. So good choice, yeah. I'm glad you mentioned Rudolf Otto. He's not read enough these days.
Yeah. So to continue, we basically know that we have two major types of religions, right? So we have monotheism, the presence of only one God, and polytheism, or also paganism, when there are many different gods. And one also German historian, and also, if I'm not mistaken, Catholic priest, Wilhelm Schmidt, in one of his writings, he stated that actually, in reality, in contrast to the general belief of people, monotheism is much older than any type of polytheism. So he stated that people initially believed in one almighty deity, let's say in one divine presence, but then it became so detached from the world, it became so distant from people, that people decided to create many different gods instead, so that these many gods would be always somewhere nearby. They will symbolize some elements of the physical world, and they can even interact with people potentially. And that was quite logical from their perspective. So they just, I think, thought that, well, it would be more practical to worship someone who's more understandable and simpler. And only after that we faced the emergence of, first of all, Judaism, then Christianity and Islam, the Abrahamic religions that changed everything, this great wave of monotheism. And here my question would be, how do you see the connection between polytheism and monotheism, between these, let's say, two conceptions? So are they totally different, independent of each other, or they do have something in common?
Yeah, that's a whole semester's worth of questions, actually. You give a very successful course on monotheism, polytheism, and the others. I think I've done it, in fact, but here's the way I think it worked for Schmidt, and also for some of the early anthropologists who were interested in religion, like E.B. Tyler, and later on the Hungarian scholar Mircea Eliade. I think I mentioned him to you recently.
Yeah.
And he was sort of a hero of mine too at one point, because he thinks it begins as Otto thinks it begins, with this sense of mystery. You don't have a name for it. It's highly psychological. This is what Jung believed too when he goes through his psychological analysis of religious feeling. And the problem is you may have this feeling individually, or you may have these questions individually, like what is that? What causes that? What is that noise? Why do I fear things? Why is dark different from night? I mean, different from light.
Yeah.
And there's no answer. So you accept the view of the people around you, right? You accept the view that is your social context. Social contexts don't create religion; they create stories. And what seems to have happened is that before there was anything like animism, or which is an early form of polytheism, we think, there were simply concepts of power. And we didn't know this, or we didn't believe this, until the sort of Polynesian and South Sea Island discoveries of the 19th century, when missionaries, who sometimes flirted with anthropology, right, would go into these places like the Bougainville Islands off Papua New Guinea, and they would encounter people who also had a concept of power, but they didn't have gods exactly. They weren't exactly polytheistic, but they had a word for the power that caused things to happen.
Yep.
And it was that magical word mana.
Yeah.
Mana came into the vocabulary.
Exactly.
So if you believe in the theory of what's called original monotheism, right, it comes from the idea that before everything gets differentiated, there is an original concept of something that holds everything together and causes everything to happen. You know, why the world turns, they didn't know it turned, but you know, why the rain comes, why the crops fail. Everything was mana. And this also seems to be reflected in, though people don't talk about it in a comfortable way, Native Americans also seem to have, like the Polynesian people, seem to have this concept, right? Native Americans talked about the Great Father, but they didn't develop, you know, rows and rows and rows of gods. They might have believed that there was a thunder god and a rain god and a this god and a that god, but basically it was just one, right? So the more we found out about Native Americans or American Indians, the more we sort of wondered, well, where did you people come from? Yeah, did you come from Central Asia? Did you come from Siberia? Where in the world did you start, right? And what did you bring with you when you crossed the Bering Strait into Alaska and then down into the Mississippi Delta? Because there was an enormous consistency among the tribes in the way they talked about religion. The spirits were there, the mana was there, it was inherent in things. So when we talk about original monotheism, we're not exactly talking about one God, but we're talking about one power that can be differentiated. When Tyler comes along, when the English rationalists kind of get their hands on this, they can explain it as, well, over time, these powers become personified, right? They become the Greek gods, they become the Roman gods, they become the gods of the Hindu castes, right? They're highly specialized in what they do. Some heal, some torment, some are devils and demons, some are not, some are saviors, right? And so there's this professionalism that begins to set in. And that happens long, I said the Greeks and Romans, but it happens long before the Greeks and Romans. It probably happens thousands of years before there was a Greek and Roman pantheon. But that's what I think happens, is yes, there is something original, but it's not too specific, but it is powerful. They have to translate everything from the Polynesian languages, which we don't understand, into something Latin. So they translate mana into anima, soul, movement, breath, spirit. But the fundamental thing about those characterizations is that they're unseen. You can see what they do. You can see the wind because you see the leaves blowing, right? You can see hurricanes. You can see the effects of these powers. But the power itself remains fundamentally invisible. And that's also going to be true in monotheism. The monotheistic God is seen through creation, right? He creates the world, he creates the stars, he creates the seas. Everything that is came from him. And the Hebrews and Muslims are very adamant about this, but him you do not see, right? You don't actually see that God. So much so.
And even in Judaism, you cannot pronounce his name.
Yeah, you can't pronounce his name because it's, They think it's known, but only one guy, the chief priest, has the right to say it, and in Islam nobody has the right to say it blasphemously. So, it's a holy name. Allah is a derivation of ilah, and it's just a word that means the God. It's a singularity. That's what I want to say. It's a singular something, but it's more like the power.
Yeah.
I think it's fascinating, but I kind of believe half the time in something like original monotheism, which means we start the study late. We start after it had become all differentiated into Zeus and Hera and Athena and blah, 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 and all these different gods, because the society was becoming professionalized, right? You need a blacksmith. You need a guy who drives a chariot. You need these guys. So
division of labor, right?
You've got gods who do everything. We need to conquer the seas and learn how to sail. So we have Poseidon, who can cause wars and drown sailors. I mean, but I think the specialization is later, actually.
Yeah. So in this case, now let's just get a bit deeper into Christianity specifically.
Right.
So the question also may sound simple, but still, what is Christianity? How can you describe Christianity? And by the way, why did Christianity become so popular and so widespread in the world, basically, during the last almost 2,000 years? And how can you define Christianity, actually?
Yeah, they tried.
Yeah, that's for sure. Yeah.
That's a really good question. I mean, your question is brilliant, really, because it's a basic question. It seems to me that the Jews sort of had the market on talking about God not as a belief system, but as a story, right? And the story was in their holy book, and Tanakh, or in the prophets, and what the rabbis taught about these things. But it was a pretty consistent system about how God interacts within history.
Yeah.
And then all at once, things change, and you get this guy, from, we think, Samaria, from a kind of Jewish minority population in a mixed race part of the world. They spoke Aramaic, which was not related to Hebrew directly, but indirectly. He doesn't speak Hebrew. He doesn't probably know Hebrew, because Hebrew is for the scholars in Jerusalem. But he's apparently a very popular guy. And as far as we know, I'm very liberal, you have to understand about this. When he teaches some things that seem to be quite unusual for the time. And the unusual part is that the rabbis did tend to do what my Catholic teachers used to do, right? They would shame me in front of the class in order to get me to stand up straight, or to behave, or to shut up. You won't get very far in life, Joseph Hoffmann, if you behave that way. Well, this God, the God of Israel, is kind of like that, right? Except it's much more violent. It's this God will kill hosts of armies who oppose Yahweh, and this God will, send molten lava into Sodom and Gomorrah to destroy the wickedness of the people and the people along with it, right? Because evil is always personified. Jesus comes along, according to the Christian tradition, and he says, no, God's not like that, right? God he's a God of second and third and fourth and fifth chances, right?
God became man so that man might become God.
Athanasius, yeah, exactly. Well, you've studied a bit, haven't you? And that's very impressive. But I think that was the attractiveness of the message, was that, frankly, I think people, even in Judaism before Jesus' time, we know that in the sort of intertestamental period, which is called the Targumic period, not in the Bible, not in the Old or the New Testament, but in a lot of the literature that was written between these periods, God is changing. God is becoming the God of the prophets. He's becoming a God of mercy and peace and grace and forgiveness. So Jesus seems to reflect. He doesn't invent. He reflects that tradition. God came to call sinners, or Jesus came, the Messiah came to call sinners, not the saved, right? Paul, for example, talks about that a lot in his many letters. So I think that's the thing. It was just an attractive message at the right time. It caught on, at least with some Jewish intelligentsia, it caught on. It never caught on with the scribes or the rabbis or the people who had seen their temple burned down twice in 100 years. Never caught on with them. But at the same time, the Romans were still stuck in their religion, right? It was not. The amazing thing to me about all of this is that the Romans accepted Christianity within just a couple of centuries.
Yeah, in the 4th century, right?
It wasn't until Constantine, right? But the empire had been bothered by these pesky Christians for 100 years or 200 years before that. But yeah, I mean, I guess the last so-called persecuting emperor was Diocletian. So in 312, Constantine says, enough, you know? Even my wife is a Christian. I can't. Yeah. My mother's a Christian. What am I going to do? Yeah, nag. So by that point, it's time to give up and say, okay, fine, you can have it. Take the empire.
Finally, please.
Yeah. But your question was about definition. And the funny thing about definition is the Christians got from the pagans this obsession, especially the pagan philosophers, with defining things. So the first thing that happens within 20 years after the Edict of Milan, so-called, in 312, is a Turkish council in a city that still exists, Ankara, called the Council of Nicaea, which gives you this long definition. It's like algebra, right? This long definition, it's a theorem of God, and defines everything about his parts, visibility. It's all stated in sort of philosophical language. And the philosophical language comes up with what's called the Trinity. And that is, technically speaking, the Christian God. It's not really the God of the Bible. It's this other redefined, repurposed God.
Christians took a lot from ancient Greeks. Right?
And they took the Trinity specifically from Plato. I mean, it's, you've got to have three of everything. And anything that isn't three is incomplete. So you've got to have three.
Homoousia also.
Geometrically perfect, yeah.
Okay, so considering Christianity, do you personally see any, as a scientist, any problems in the current state and the current way of development of Christianity as an institution? So is there any crisis of Christianity as an institution, basically?
That's a really hard question, because I don't see.
Every time somebody said, I don't see, I mean, Feuerbach was saying in the 19th century, Christianity is dead, right? Nietzsche says the same thing in philosophy, God is dead.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the reason they say that is because they think that it's become a series of absurdity. There's a very famous statement by the American philosopher Emerson, who actually had a house near where my family lived in Boston. And Emerson was invited as a graduate of Harvard himself to give what was called the Divinity School address, because he practiced as a minister in Greater Boston. And they didn't expect him to do much but get up and give a standard speech about how wonderful Jesus was and what a great ethical teacher he was. They didn't want any of the Trinity stuff because they didn't believe it already in the 19th century at Harvard. Everybody was an atheist. And Emerson gets up and he says, Jesus came to preach a God of love and forgiveness, and you have given us in your New Testament a monster, right? Needless to say, Harvard asked them not to come back the next year to give the commencement speech. You've given your last graduation speech. But that became a standard view of Christianity, was that the church had spoiled Jesus, right? The church had given us this character who never really existed. And they did it not in the New Testament, but in their interpretation of the New Testament. They didn't like Paul very much, but a lot of people don't like Paul, because they thought that he kind of ruined the essence of Christianity. But yeah, I think it's a fair question. The future of Christianity is not bright. I think the last surveys that have been done, I mean, it used to be easy to say, well, the French are good Catholics, but they don't believe in God, right? that's kind of true, right? They were secular Christians. They didn't believe anything literally, but they still sort of spiritually felt a kind of, I mean, look what happened when Notre Dame almost burned to the ground, right? They're all out there weeping and crying, but as much for a cultural treasure or something that defines what it means to be French or Parisian, than as to be a Roman Catholic. I don't think there was a lot of Catholic in that, but the idea of losing something that had been a symbol of French spirituality for so long. But I think the French are avidly secular. The country that worries me the most is not in the Middle East, it is the United States, south of Canada. It worries me because there are, within that population, not every city is Boston. Some cities are Mobile, Alabama, and there are cities all over the country that have people who have an almost Neanderthal view of religion in general and Christianity in particular. And it leads to all kinds of social problems, right? I don't necessarily find what they believe in the Christian Bible, but they think they do, right? They're saying that the Bible talks about slaves, and that Jews had slaves too, not just Arab traders, but Hebrews had slaves. That's probably true because everybody has slaves, but they're using it as a justification for what's called now, I think, the 1619 movement, the idea that slaves in the South, in the United States, were authorized by God because the Bible doesn't specifically prohibit the ownership of slaves, and so it must permit the ownership of slaves. So it was never a problem, right? Civil War should have been won by the South because the South was on the side of God. It's just crazy. That's when the Bible can become mischievous and problematical. And I think in the future it will become more problematical for some people. And a lot of people won't care. A lot of people don't care already. A lot more people will cease to care. Yeah.
Okay. So Professor, I know that some time ago you personally initiated a so-called Jesus Project, the Jesus Project. I am a Christian, I believe in Jesus, and that's why for me it's so interesting. I'm so interested in what were the results of this Jesus Project. So do we know something new about the historical figure of Jesus? Let's say.
Not yet. The Jesus Project and the preceding scholarly consultation, which was called the Jesus Seminar, which was started by some professors of mine, one of whom is still alive, John Dominic Crossan, who's an ex-Dominican priest, was an attempt to separate. It sounds easy, right? Like you're just sort of peeling a grape or something, but it's not like that at all. To strip away the so-called accretions, the stuff that has been believed about Jesus from the things he really said or the things he really did. So the interesting thing about the Jesus Seminar, the preceding consultation, is that everybody within the Jesus consultation was a religion, not a religious, a religion scholar, right? Most of them were New Testament scholars, like Crossan himself, like me, because I was part of that seminar too, as a younger scholar. It came up before it sort of went out of business with a list of, I think, 82? I may be wrong about that number, but about 82 verses that are indisputably attributable to Jesus himself. And then another larger number that we can't know about. And then another slightly smaller number that we think were given to Jesus by the writers of the New Testament. Now that sounds really arrogant. How do scholars have the arrogance to say what Jesus said? And the answer is there are methodologies, most of them developed in Germany in the 19th century, to do this kind of redaction and synoptic criticism. I mean, there are ways to do it. You don't get, if you use Bayes' theorem, right? You don't get 100% certainty about these things, but you do come close to a kind of probability. So the Jesus project was not specifically designed to do what the Jesus Seminar had done. We had a different enemy who was much easier to defeat. So the project didn't, it's still technically in existence, but it doesn't have much to do anymore. Because there was a group of scholars who weren't scholars. They weren't well trained. They came from nowhere. Most of them had studied weird stuff in school. And they had a theory which was first approached in the 19th century, that Jesus never existed. He was like the pagan gods. He was like Osiris or like Zeus or any other god with a story, especially like Dionysus. There were these stories about him, and they became collected as a kind of ancient literature called gospel. And then these stories were believed as true stories by the early Christians. I can't use the word I would normally use to describe this, but it begins with B and has an S in the middle, but it was an absolutely absurd theory. So, but we decided that there was a danger of this kind of nonsense being repeated in the 21st century. So, along with Morris Casey, who is a professor of Old Testament studies at the University of Nottingham, and Stephanie, she died a couple of years ago, McCaffrey, who was probably the most vigorous enemy of this group you can imagine. Three of us actually formed a committee to create the Jesus Project. And we published a lot. I mean, we published a lot of articles. And then while we were still under siege for denying the absurdity of the idea that Jesus was a myth, I think it's absurd. I could go on forever about that, but it is my view that the idea that Jesus never existed is a palpably stupid idea and can be disproved through normal historical scholarship. It doesn't need a lot of, theological mumbo jumbo to prove it. So that's the story. What I guess we can never be sure of is the question that Albert Schweitzer asked at the beginning of the 20th century in his book, Das Leben Jesu. He wrote a very famous biography of Jesus. And in the end, he has that wonderful sort of Swiss-German angst about things. And he says, his last paragraph, I'll never forget reading it the first time. And it's sometimes called The Quest for the Historical Jesus, right? That's the English title of the book. And he says, he comes to us as one unknown, right? We don't know much, but we know enough. I'm paraphrasing now, right? He comes to us as one unknown. There's something, kind of eschatologically different about this guy. And I like that. It preserves the mystery, but mysteries aren't superstition. Mysteries are mysteries, right? And that's sort of where I'll leave it. I think it's fair to say that nobody who reads the New Testament comes away with a biography, but everybody who reads it comes away with a sense that that's interesting. That's very different. That's mysterious. And the more you study this in the context of Greek and Roman and other cultural literatures, the more you can see how different Christianity is from those religions. It's very different. It's a strange thing.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
And considering the future, do we have potential to, let's say, discover more about the historical figure of Jesus Christ?
I believe that's true.
Do you believe you have? We have question.
Yeah. In fact, I even believe, because as a beginning graduate student at Harvard,
we worked 5 days a week, sometimes 6 hours a day, on the sort of Nag Hammadi, the Gnostic Gospels. And we enjoyed doing it, but it was so clear to us as people who had to learn Coptic, which is a form of the Egyptian language, right? But in Greek characters, written in Greek, but idiomatically, the language, the vocabulary is all taken from Old Egyptian. These Gospels were written somewhere in the early 3rd century, not too long after the Orthodox Gospels, the canonical Gospels were written. But you need to read 3 of these, and you don't need to learn Coptic to do this, to realize that these people were just strange, right? They were culties in Egypt who probably were trying to extend or expand. That's when it gets hard, because Christianity decided somewhere along the way to close its canon, to say 27 books, only 27, that's it, halas, that's all we need. But the Gnostics kept on writing, and so did others. We call these people hereses, heretics. Mm-hmm. Yeah? But they were heretics because they decided that Christianity was an open book, not a closed book, and that could continue to expand the story through the years. And every time they did, Jesus becomes a little bit different, a little bit stranger, a little bit more powerful. And I did a lot of early work on that subject. In fact, I think I wrote 2 or 3 translations of these things, and then one of the apocryphal Gospels called Jesus Outside the Gospels, actually, when I was interested in that subject. But now I'm much more interested in what we were talking about, and how much can you know? It's a good question. Yeah, it keeps you going.
So you said you think that we do have potential to study more about Jesus, to
it's
discover
inevitable.
something.
It's inevitable because we haven't even finished the archaeology on the subject. I'm not an archaeologist as much as a papyrologist. I work with paper. I work with
texts.
Yeah, with fragments of text. I'm not as good at putting it together, but I'm pretty good at translating it. Yeah, and so every year there's just a fragment or something somewhere, often in an unhelpful place like Egypt. If it's found in Egypt, it probably isn't close to Orthodox Christianity. That's what we've learned, right? And the Gnostic Gospels were found in Naj Hammadi, which is a village just outside Cairo, but full of weird monks and priests who decided they would continue the literary activity of the apostles. I think for sure we will discover more on paper or of paper, and we will learn how to read it. If we don't know already, we probably do know already. There's a really good chance we're going to find more. I hope in my lifetime, because it's something to look forward to. Yeah,
it's very interesting, actually. So, Professor, that was my very last question.
Okay.
Thank you very much for participating in this conversation.
You're quite welcome.
As for me, it was a real pleasure. So thank you very much.
For me too.
Professor.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.